Again. So I think this will be our last one for week one. So in the last one, we ended up talking about the social readjustment scale, which really looks at stress and how it impacts our health objectively. And that means that the research, there were these very specific life events that were given weight, and then you add up how many you've had, add up your score, and that's how more likely you are to get sick based on that, on how much stress is in your life based on these major life events. And when I say major life events, I mean like, death of a spouse or a parent or moving is considered a major life event. Certainly, like divorce, marriage is considered, so major life events that happen that do cause the system stress. So, but now we're looking at subjective appraisal. And this is Richard Lazarus, and he was a psychologist and very early promoter of like the importance of emotions. So not looking at things just objectively, but subjectively, and looking at how does a person independently and individually assess their own response to things that happen in their lives. Now, he developed hazards and uplift scales. So combines measures for hassles, the daily hassles, irritants and pressures, all these things that happen. And what he found when doing like an adult sample, a middle-aged adult sample, he found like key hazards are things like weight concern, family member health concern, rising prices, the things that in our daily lives can cause us stress. But he also wanted to look at what causes us positive emotions, what causes the good things in life that might maybe even help us balance out some of these hassles, right? So uplifts, positive encounters and experiences. So things like relating well with a partner, a good relationship with friends, being successful in completing tasks, and so forth. Those were things that he found were good. I'm sorry. I tend to get in the way here, and I don't mean to. Tend to be uplifts for us. And I have other information available for you to look at, to further look at a lot of this stuff. Now, so hassles, going back over here with this lady. Lazarus hypothesized that an accumulation of acute stress, those are those little things that happen, such as locking keys in the car, oh my God, or getting stuck in traffic, being late, tend to trigger an anger response in us. Now, that's a fight or flight. That's a fight response, right? An anger. We're like, road rage, that builds up over time. And that can be certainly not good for our blood pressure, our heart, things like that. Chronic stress that's more linked to fear and chronic stress. Now, he said, okay, so I'm sorry. An accumulation of acute stress seems to build anger. And accumulate like chronic stress, that is something like the bad relationship that doesn't end, the bad job that doesn't end, has a link to fear and anxiety. Now, how I would explain that might be that when we're in something over and over and longer amount of time, it can feel a little trapping, and anxiety can build up around that fear of how does this end, where does this end, how am I going to get out, a little existential, rather than just kind of the daily irritants that happen that annoy us, piss us off, right? But the things that are like kind of important and valuable to our life that just kind of continue and go on can definitely create the kind of what might be more attached to the fly part of fight or flight and fear, because that's very fear oriented. So Lazarus had this thing called core relational themes. So this is kind of a big part of his overall appraisal system, and which is what he talks about as appraising, subjective appraisal. How we perceive or judge a threat, how I judge the threat of being late or judge something that's going on in my life, plays a really large role and impact on them. So even if we look at large life events, so this is going to be a hard one, but say like if, especially for like a middle-aged person or something, where you have a parent who's you've had to caretake for a long time, and that's very stressful. And the death of that parent is going to be very stressful. You might, however, by the time that happens, appraise that passing in a way that's also um, it's they're no longer in pain. You're able to appraise it appraises differently than just being incredibly stressful because of the part and the role it's played in your life over time. And that can be for anything. Moving is considered in the social readjustment scale certainly a major life event that's very stressful. If that move is an absolute fabulous thing for you and it creates a lot of excitement and it's an uplift, Lazarus would say it's going to have a different impact. Okay, so Lazarus and Folkman focused on the idea of appraisal, how we personally evaluate the significance of an event and then judge it as either a threat or a challenge. Now, here's where it can get a little bit tricky in understanding. Each emotion, so fear, anger, love, joy, hope, whatever it is, he linked to a theme. And so, how we appraise our situations involves how we link it to certain emotions and the meaning we give them. So, if, for example, fear is linked to threat, anger to perceive injustice. So, if something has happened and I believe that I have been treated wrongly, somebody was, unfair and unjust to me in a certain situation, that I'm going to that's a core theme around injustice. If I feel like I've been treated, and that's very linked to anger. If I'm afraid, I'm walking alone at night, or something, or there's something coming in the future and I don't know what's going to be, and it causes me fear. It feels like a threat. Happiness is very linked to the idea of success and hope to possibility. So, how I define it in its core relational theme is what is it? How am I understanding it? How am I assessing it in my mind? Am I seeing something as a possibility? Am I seeing something as a big success for me? Then it's going to link to that certain emotion. And how I define that and how that shows up with a sense of meaning will define my response to it, which will then have a lot to do with how much stress it puts on me in the long term of life. I hope that makes any kind of sense. All right, so we've talked about, let me go back real quick just to before we move on. We've talked about what stress does inside the body just a little bit, what it feels like, and why it's doing that fight or flight response, and that's what it's doing in the body, and how Cannon understood that, how Selye understood that with the general adaptation response. Then we looked at Lazarus, the social readjustment scale, looking at trying to link health and illness based on major life events objectively. And Lazarus looking at hassles and uplifts, and looking at things more subjectively, and that they will impact us and our health differently based on what kind of meaning we place upon them in our lives. Okay, so that's kind of different ways. There's no real one way to say that this is it. There's different theories, different outlooks. Okay, so types of stressors though, and this next section this is why I'm not gonna, this is all gonna be on this video because I'm just gonna look through this. You can read further about this, but I'm just gonna look through this kind of more briefly to look at different types of stressors. Looking at a stressor as any real or imagined situation, circumstance, or stimulus perceived by mind or body to be a threat. We have bioecological, psychointrapersonal, and social types of stressors. So bioecological are going to be external in nature, maybe kind of beyond our awareness and our unconscious, that are impacting us, and we may not be so much aware of it, that they impact our circadian rhythms, our ability to sleep soundly. Things like seasonal affective disorder, which is sad. So people that live in the Northwest and have constant drizzle might have this more often because they don't get enough sunlight, and it impacts people differently. But that might impact mood, might impact the amount of stress we have, jet lag if we've traveled, environmental toxins, electrical pollution, solar radiation, noise pollution. There are studies that have linked noise, even if You're not even always aware of it, but you live someplace where it's very noisy, and the impact it can have on the stress response system in them. The kind of little environmental irritants that we're not even always going, oh, this is stressing me out, but that our body is perceiving, our sensory, that we're taking that input in, and our body is reacting to it, maybe in a low grade way all the time, can have an impact over time. So, psychointrapersonal influences, we're going to talk much more about the psychology of stress. So, I'm not really going to go into this a whole lot here. Thoughts, perceptions, beliefs, values, opinions, attitudes. Um, Psychointrapersonal, what we think, how we perceive, how we relate to other people. All of these things can cause stress in our life and actually believed to make up the greatest percentage in art and in society today, the kinds of stressors that we are in. Then we have social influences that we really can't always dictate, but like urban sprawl, overcrowding, traffic, long lines. I'm sorry, it's kind of cut off. Um, but even social influences in our own lives, financial insecurity, cultural assimilation, socioeconomic status, human rights violations, things that are like the psycho-intrapersonal is going to be very intrapersonal. If we think about it in terms of circles, it's going to be right there. It's the people in our lives, our work, our all the things that we're dealing with on a daily basis inside of our minds and body and in our relationships. This one is going to go out a little bit farther, but it's going to have impact on our daily lives in different ways and certainly can cause us stress. Our world is changing very quickly and all the time, and it's expanding. Technology is expanding. All of these things can be very positive. They can also be very stressful. Change stresses people out, and in a world that's changing very quickly, it can be very stressful. News, having access to things all the time, um, again, can just cause our systems to be on edge a lot. So college stress, this may be applied to some of you and maybe not to others, but there's a lot of different things when young people are entering college and going out on their own, maybe for the first time, that can bring about a lot of different, again, change can cause stress because the system doesn't know what to expect. And then we'll talk about the brain and how it's kind of always scanning the world for things that are safe and not safe. And we get, when we're out there, it has a lot of fodder for that. So, of course, roommate, professional pursuits, academic deadlines. The American Psychological Association does surveys, and I think it was at least in the 2015 one, the most stressed out population are our young adults, and our teens. It's kind of amazing the amount of pressures that they seem to be ingesting. Anxiety is growing. It seems to be uh, an epidemic these days among our young people. Um, and there's many potential reasons for that, and that can be looked into. But for me, I think one of the important things we have to do is learn coping mechanisms. We have to learn to cope with a changing world. And the world is changing, and our lives are always changing as we grow and take on different responsibilities and move forward. Um, Sleep, so important. I have some things in modules, some information about sleep and what it kind of does to the system and what not getting enough. And it seems to be something, especially young people aren't getting enough sleep these days. And the brain does a lot of cleanup during sleep. It does a lot of assimilation of information during sleep. It restores and refreshes itself. The body does, tissues do. When it doesn't get enough and it doesn't get enough time to do all those things, then things break down easier. Um, Different parts of the brain react, in ways that are not useful to us. So please look farther into that with the information that I've provided. Sleep hygiene is just really important, and that's how do we honor and treat our sleeping the way we should, and do we consider it important? and it's certainly important to our brain in the way it functions, into our memory, into our mood, into our body's ability into our immune system, our body's ability to recover and rejuvenate itself. It's very important. Okay, I think my time is up and what I'm allowed to do here. So on my little screencast thing, so I'm gonna go.